Hey folks, welcome to Last Breath Woodworks. I'm Josh. Now in today's video we're going to be doing something a little bit different than what I've been doing. We're not working on the lathe. We're actually going to be doing some flat work. And this whole project is based out of this little guy. Charger for PlayStation controller. Now I've got two of them because this is going to be something for my daughter's fiance, my soon-to-be son-in-law, as of this next summer. And the tricky part is going to be trying to work with all these angles and curves to make a charging dock that these will sit on one above the other, but it has to have a base on it so that it can either sit on a desk or table or be able to be hung on a wall if needed. And of course, the other thing to think about is this little guy. We have to have a way to get the cord to that charger and kind of conceal it to make the piece look artistic or beautiful. So I really don't have any plans. This is about all I got. Just a few sketches, a couple measurements. Actually just kind of winging this and flying by the seat of my pants. So we'll see where this goes. I'll take as much footage as I can and include as many measurements as I can. And hopefully it inspires some of you to go out and try something like this on your own. I've only got a day to do this, so we're going to start out with two pieces of walnut that are 3 inches wide, an inch thick, and about 21 inches long. Two pieces of white oak that are 1 by 1. Two more that are a 1/2 inch by 1. And then two pieces of some walnut board I had with a lot of sapwood. I just glued together, made two panels that are about 5/8 of an inch thick, and a paper template. That's about as sophisticated as this is getting so far. So let's go and see where this thing takes us. First thing I did was cut one of those walnut boards down to 18 inches and then just marked a line right down the center of it on the back side. And then on that line marked it at 1/4 inch, 2 3/4 inch, and 13 3/4 inch. Then at the drill press, I drilled that first hole, or bottom one, to a depth of a 1/2 inch. And then the other two holes just got drilled clean through, all the way through. With that done, I just measured down from the top, 3/4 inch on each side, and just used a lid from a sour cream container to mark out a radius, and then a socket to mark out a radius on the insides of those two oak 1 by 1s. Now at the router table, I installed a keyhole bit so that I could make this thing able to be hung on a wall. I just used that hole in the bottom to adjust my fence, and you can see there's a line on the fence even with that bit. Then I just put two lines on the top of my board to mark my start and stop points. Then just carefully plunge that board down onto that bit on the first line, and then carefully pushed it forward until it reached the second line. Once it was there, I just held the piece firmly in place and shut off the router and waited for it to stop spinning before removing that piece. Next, I swapped that bit out for a 1/4 inch straight bit. And then, since my fence was already perfectly adjusted, I just adjusted the height of that bit till it just tickled or grazed the bottom of that hole. Now I just had to cut a channel from the bottom all the way to that top hole. You can tell by the smoke and chatter that that bit is pretty well shot, so it's on the list to be replaced. Once I had that channel cut, I swapped out for a 1/2 inch dovetail bit. Now you can see the cord there. Please, folks, be safe and unplug your machines or tools when you're changing bits or blades. You don't want to lose a digit over something that simple. Next, I took that other piece of walnut and cut out 2 8-inch sections from it. Now, you can see here that I've got it clamped to the fence with a stop block because there's no way I was going to try to hold this thing with my hand. Just not safe at all. So using that same 3/4 inch Forstner bit, I bored a hole right down the center of it to a depth of 1 5/8 inches. Taking my time, going real slow so that it didn't catch or wiggle, and I was really afraid of it breaking out the sides because there's only 1/8 of material left. But it worked out just fine. Now those pieces headed over to the table saw where I had a dado stack set up for hogging out some material. Now here you can see I made a template the same size as those blocks and marked out 1 inch at the base, or where the hole was, and 3/4 at the tip, and everything in between is going to get some material taken out. Then I also marked some angle lines on there that I found and measured with an angle gauge so that that charger would fit down inside that little slot or triangle perfectly. With the dado stack set at 1/2 inch, I just started from a line on one side and put a stop block on the other to get that perfect cut inside. And that's why I did this step first while those pieces were still square. With my crosscut sled on the table saw, I then took that template and lined up those marks with the groove. Used some painter's tape, CA glue, and activator with a scrap piece of wood to make a temporary jig to hold everything in place to get those like 5-degree angles cut safely, since I don't have tracks and clamps in my sled. Once that glue is set, I did a test cut on that template to make sure everything was right. And it was, so then I just had at it with the 2 walnut pieces. Then I just reversed the process or repeated it again with the other side, did a test cut, and it turned out great as well, so finished off those 2 little triangle pieces that are going to hold the chargers. Next, I took those 2 1/2 inch by 1 inch oak strips and cut them in half so I had 4 pieces. And then just used some Titebond 2 and then CA and activator to slap these together. Now, I wasn't worried about the overhang on each end. We're going to cut those off flush later. I also wanted to add a taper to that upright or backer, but my sled wasn't big enough to hold that 18-inch piece. So I just used a board and the same clamping method with the tape and CA glue to fix that on there and cut that long 18-inch taper to about a 1-degree angle. So it was about 3 inches at the top and 2 1/4 at the bottom. Once that was all cut on both sides, I went back to the disc sander, and that mark I made earlier with that radius, I just rounded the top of that walnut chunk off and kind of gave it a nice finishing look. You'll see and understand that a lot later. Once that was round, then I grabbed those oak 1-bys that I had marked up and rounded the tops of those as well, and then glued those 3 pieces together and set them all aside while I moved on to the next step. Next, I just took that handmade and hand-cut paper template I made and traced it out onto one of those walnut sapwood panels. Then I used a bandsaw, a drill, a jigsaw, disc sander, and spindle sander to fine-tune it all into almost a perfect shape. Once that was done, I once again grabbed the wood glue and slathered it pretty full, leaving just a couple corners empty so that I could add a couple dabs of CA glue so that I could line it up on the other panel and hold it in place while I put the clamps on so that it didn't kind of slide or grease around on me. Once the clamps were all on, I just threw it in front of my shop heater to kind of get it to quick cure and dry while I ran in the house to grab a quick bite for dinner. Once I came back, I just used the bandsaw again to trim that bottom panel out within about a 1/16 of an inch of the top, and then just used a 1/2 inch bottom bearing flush trim bit to trim that rough edge off and basically marry the 2 pieces together so they look like one. It actually turned out a lot better than I was expecting it would. Now, when it came time to cut the tails off of those little charger brackets or triangles, I had to be a little creative because, to be honest, my miter gauge is just absolute garbage. So I used the edge of that walnut and lined it up with the slot in my table to get my fence close. Then I made my first cut about 1/8 of an inch away and kept fine-tuning until both ears of that oak were even before making my final flush cut. Once that gauge was set perfect, I trimmed the tips off and got both of them squared up, and then used the same process to cut the tails off of that backer or upright piece. Now it was time to marry that base to the upright. So I used the calipers to measure the thickness of that base, locked them in, and then scribed a line on that upright so I knew how much material to take off. Now I had put the dado stack back in and set it up to a height of 1/4 inch, and then just kind of nibbled away at that until I snuck up on that line I scribed. Once that was done, I had to figure out how to cut those edges square because of that taper. So I tilted the dado stack about 1 degree, raised it up to a 1/2 inch, and once again nibbled away and snuck up on that line till I was even with what I had cut earlier. After I had marked the width of that tenon from the upright against that base, I needed to know how deep to cut a mortise in it, so I measured it with the calipers and then set the height of that dado stack so it just tickled the bottom of that caliper. Then I just went from the lines I had marked for the width from side to side and hogged that material out. I probably took a little more off at one time than I should have, but it turned out fine. After all the pieces were final sanded, it was time to put this thing together, so I just once again used some Titebond 2, CA glue and activator, and using my square and everything to line everything up, popped it together so that I didn't have to use clamps. But trying to figure out how to get those brackets to line up so that the hole for the cord was even inside was a nightmare. But then I realized that a 13 millimeter socket fit perfectly in that 3/4 inch hole. So I dropped it in there, gave the bracket some glue, set it over that socket, and then used my angle bracket and a square to get everything lined up and true, and then a couple shots of activator to hold it in place so that it didn't move. It worked great. Once the glue had dried, I wanted to make sure this thing was sturdy, so I added some 1 5/8 trim screws from the back. Pre-drilled the holes first to make sure that hard walnut and oak wouldn't crack, but once those were installed, then I touched everything up a little bit by hand and gave it a couple coats of shellac. Hey folks, it's done. Not gonna lie, it got to be a late night last night, but still got the thing done in a day. I'm pretty happy with it. Everything seems to have lined up, squared up, joints are good, and I like the colors of the wood. I was hoping to use maple and walnut, but I didn't have any maple thought out that was long enough for this backer. But you can kind of see the shape. Keeping with the gaming theme, I tapered that back and added these contours on top to make it look like a PlayStation console. The bottom is just a controller shape, and then I had cut out this little indent. I wish I would have maybe raised this a little bit higher, but at least here there's a place you can stick a remote, earbuds, whatever. It's just a little catch tray. Now, while I was waiting for glue to dry, I went a little step further and I took these chargers, lightly sanded them, and added some edging veneer. Unfortunately, all I had was maple, which would have worked in the original case, but I put it on anyway, and when I added the oak stain, it, for some reason, kind of turned orangey. I don't know. But at least it still looks better than the white plastic. Now, you can see these just set right in there. So that's where the whole logic behind all those angles and cuts was to get this a nice tight fit so that these controllers will still fit over the top without, any interference from the wood. Now, the reason I kept this height here was in case this is sitting on a desk and there's stuff on each side, you can still get the back controller up and over the top of the front one. Now, The other big concern that I had was the cord. So it actually worked out pretty good, that 13 millimeter socket. I mean, of all the sockets, why did it have to be the 13 millimeter, right? Could have been the 10, but no, it worked out really good. The cord slides through easy. And then you just have to kind of flex it down a little in the back. And when you put it in, the pressure of that cord pushing down into that hole actually pushes the controller right up tight to the front so that it's not going to move. And then on the back, can tuck that cord in. And if it's sitting on a table, it can just come out the bottom. And then I don't have the other cord for the other charger. My daughter just let me borrow that one for reference. But then you could twist those two together so that they stay in there. And then this way, if you wanted to, you could still hang this on a wall and let them pull straight out the bottom. Now, in this whole process, the one tool that was probably the most useful was this little $5 angle gauge. This is what allowed me to measure, to figure out the angles of these chargers, everything. The angles to cut the bottom on that upright after I added that taper. So this was the go-to tool for this project. Now, as usual, I'll put up some glamour shots at the end. And thanks for watching Last Breath Woodworks.